Okay. So I think I've got that open already. So this is the PowerPoint I'm working with, Exchange 2019, configure CAS. Next class, I'll talk about protocols a little bit. That'll be a shorter one, but a little bit more focus on certain things. This is more of a broad overview. Okay. Any questions before I get going? Everybody hear me okay in La La Land there? I'm talking about you guys. We have no technical difficulties though? Yeah. Silence. La la la. Okay. That means you heard me. All right. I feel good now. Okay, so configuring Exchange Server, this is the client access service part. So after you've done the basic install, and then you get into that really, the weedy part, you're getting into the weeds of certificates, that's when we're talking about client access services, okay? It's really quite important to get the certificates going because it's the only real way we have to secure Exchange. If we don't do that, all of our information is flying around willy-nilly. Everybody can view it, So certificates are really important in this sense, especially with online, okay? Because everything is external. You're going across, the Wild West internet. So you want to make sure that SSL is working for you. So just to reiterate, we've got two main roles these days. There's the edge role and the mailbox role. The edge role is like your bodyguard, okay? You can't be your own bodyguard, so there's no way to squish that role into mailbox role, okay? But mailbox role used to be a bunch of different roles, and they've all kind of consolidated in together. There used to be a separate mailbox role, a separate client access role, as well as a bunch of other ones, okay? And then Microsoft was just kind of really hung up on it at the time. They thought that was good internet architecture. And then they found that the administrators were like, I hate working with it this way. And they listened to their clients. Okay. So the edge role should be in a DMZ. That's going to be lab 1, facing the internet incoming email. So that could be some random server, which is just connecting to you. It's often spam, right? We're not really going to go into that, but MX records and DNS, which is a topic you probably haven't heard of before. It's just a different type of record in DNS, which is specifically about mail. It stands for mail exchange, okay? When you're trying to figure out like a domain like google.com or gmail.com, let's say, your client software has to figure out, how do I deliver this to gmail.com? It'll talk to its server and whatever server you're using, and your server will then query DNS to figure out the answer of how do I deliver this stuff, okay? So we will get into that in depth with Lab 1, but we're not really going to focus on it right now. If you don't have an edge server, the MX record that you would normally have for your edge role would then go directly to your mailbox server. Not the ideal thing. It's kind of like punching a hole for remote desktop into your home machine through the internet, right? We don't usually want to punch a hole through directly to our local area network. So people do it. It's not necessarily the best choice, okay? Okay, now the client access service, that is what we're going to focus on today. This is basically, it used to be a role, and now it's just a service, which the whole point of it is to interact with all things client related, okay? So if you're a client and you're talking to Exchange, you're doing it through CAS. There's no other way that you get to do it. Okay? That's as opposed to being a domain administrator or an Exchange administrator. We can hook in other ways, but just the regular users, they got to go through the client access service. And the idea is that service is going to take the hit if anybody's trying to hack in. Okay, so kind of like the edge role service in a way. It's meant to take on that danger. But it's meant to do more than that. It's not just a security feature. It's meant to make sure that clients who do connect in are sending properly formed connections. So for example, if you don't have SSL working on your client system, Exchange is going to notice that the client access service will be like, whoa, wait a minute, you're supposed to be encrypting. So let's set up an encryption session, right? Back in Server 2013, this used to be a separate role. So it really acts as an intermediary. Rather than a bodyguard, I'd say it's like an admin support for a manager, right? So they're kind of handling all the procedural stuff so that the mailbox role can just focus on mailboxes, okay? Just on the database, the data itself, that kind of thing. Now, it supports connections from a bunch of different clients. So you have Microsoft Outlook. You can also use a web app. And there's another protocol called ActiveSync, which Microsoft, it's a proprietary Microsoft protocol, which is really for systems that don't speak Exchange. Okay. So if you're not a proprietary Outlook, like they don't really publish how Exchange works, right? But they build a client that knows, and that all works very well. ActiveSync is for things like, say, a Samsung device that doesn't know how to speak Exchange necessarily, but still needs to talk to the server and get mail. Okay. So developers can actually talk through ActiveSync without necessarily having every idea of how, all the little bells and whistles that are involved in the protocol. Outlook Web App bypasses the whole thing by just being a web interface running on IIS on your server. Okay. So these are different approaches to actually accessing things. And, this is more for phones and tablets and stuff like that. Outlook is more for business users in the workplace. Outlook Web App is mostly for road warriors who are coming and going quite a lot, right? I actually use Outlook Web App pretty much exclusively because sometimes I'm in class, sometimes I'm over there. I don't take my laptop with me when I go home. So I just figure let's keep it the same interface everywhere. I just use the web interface. But some people like the extra features that come with Microsoft Outlook. I'm not one of those. But all of these are going to talk to the client access service. And if you get something like, say, what is it, Thunderbird, the open source client, Thunderbird can talk to Outlook, and it could either do it through POP or SMTP. Those are the protocols. That's also client access service. Okay. It also does some other functions. So it provides access to free busy data and Exchange calendars. That actually used to be a separate role. So it's just gotten a little kitchen sinky. Okay. Now, the things that we're going to really focus on and things that are related to manipulating CAS, configuring certificates, which you may have already finished up by now, or you may not have, but that's a biggie, okay? Configuring auto discover. We're not really going to do that too much, but it is something that can come in an organization, okay? Auto discover is just the fact, when you launch Outlook, and it figures out your name and your email address, and it automatically sets up your account for you without you having to type anything except next, next, next. That's auto discover. Okay. What it's really doing is that it's talking to Active Directory and getting all the answers it needs from the network. Okay, so that users don't have to be too smart about it, right? Because then that'll probably hold things up a lot. I'll go more into that in a little bit here. But mostly auto discover just works, okay? When it doesn't just work, well, there's some bad juju in your environment. We'll get to that in a little bit too. Configuring Outlook anywhere, I'll talk about that a little later. But that's basically a marketing term, okay, which describes a couple of protocols. Which are used by Microsoft, which they don't really share all the details about. Configuring Outlook Web App, that's something that you can do with CAS. We do that a little bit, but not too much. Configuring Exchange ActiveSync, we're not really going to mess around with too much, unless we get cloud access in the second part of the course. Okay. If we're able to do that, then we'll go ahead, and I might be able to get you to take your phone and set up an account or something. I don't want to do anything too outrageous because it's your phone. But, without the right devices, it doesn't make a lot of sense to work with it. Configuring ActiveSync device access, that's another thing we'll talk about in a second. But basically, You can say we're only allowing, I don't know, do they still make Blackberries? We're only allowing Blackberries to connect to our Exchange, something like that, right? Where if you actually buy from a certain vendor, you can actually say, yeah, those are allowed to connect in, but everything else isn't. And then there's configuring SMTP. This is it's very simple at a certain level, but this is essential if you want to talk to anybody outside your organization. Okay, so the way Microsoft does things is that they adopt open standards, and then they mess with them to come up with their proprietary standards, and then they sell that basically. But with SMTP, if you want to talk to any other organization, like say Gmail, those are using the classic open protocols. And so Exchange has to be able to speak SMTP in order for interoperability to exist. Okay, so configuring defaults. By default, you are not configuring defaults, configuring certificates. By default, you're using self-signed certificates. This is not good, okay? I know that up until now, we've probably had you just create self-signed certificates. They're essentially useless from a security perspective, okay? They're placeholders that are meant to be replaced with something else that takes a little bit more work to set up. So although Exchange does offer the self-signed certificate, you're going to get complaints from the client software constantly about it, okay? So you really want to set up a valid certificate from a valid CA, whether that's paying somebody on the outside, like VeriSign or Symantec or something, or whether you're going to be setting up your own enterprise CA within your environment, which is what most organizations do, okay? Now, the purpose of all of that is so that we can set up SSL for all communications with the server. So encryption, that's a big thing we want. Authentication, we authenticate the servers all the time. Sometimes we authenticate the clients if we configure it that way. Okay, that's really up to us, whether we want to authenticate the clients. It is extra work, and it is, there's more things that could go wrong with clients when they're setting themselves up. But there are some clients who really want that kind of authentication in place. Okay, so when you're configuring certificates, you'll be doing this in the exercise, but it's really going to be like, do this, do this, do this, do this, right? We don't really explain too much. So this is kind of where I spend a little bit of time talking about why we're doing what we're doing. Okay, now, a thing that a certificate needs absolutely is a subject name. If you don't have a subject name that is recognized by others, then it's not really going to be accepted, okay? But there's something else that we set up with web servers, and in this case, Exchange is really, it's running off of IIS as well. You want subject alternative names, okay? Subject alternative names are just kind of like aliases. So, my name's Matthew, everybody calls me Matt, right? Aiden Amingus. Hey, you create the accounts, man. But the idea here is you're gonna, if you have a web server or an Exchange server, it's gonna need a couple of names at least to function. Okay, so usually you'll want a subject alternative name of Outlook dot whatever your domain is and Autodiscover dot whatever your domain is. Okay. If that's all happening internally, that'll just work pretty easily just with the default install. As soon as you go into the outside world, you've got to set it up in your DNS, okay, your external DNS. And so that's going to be something that we kind of play around a little bit with in this course, but we're not going to do it right away. We'll come back to it, okay? But just to say, when you're setting up a certificate, you want to be able to say, yeah, I might be going by that name, or I might be going by that name. And if either of those, is being accessed, present this certificate. It should be good for both, okay? You can then go a little crazy with that, split it out into a million pieces. So if you wanted to separate everything out, you could say, well, I've got, I've got one server which is doing webmail. I've got another one which is doing handling Outlook requests, another one that's handling the auto discover requests, another one for the offline address book, one for Exchange Web Services, and one for Exchange ActiveSync. You get into a really big organization with a lot of mail. They may have a lot of servers, Exchange servers, some of them serving different functions within here, and you can give them each a name like that they can refer to. Or you could put it all in one box and just split out the names with the idea that in the future, I may want to create other servers and split it out later, okay? We're just going to stick with the basics, so we're not going to get too fancy about it. How do we configure certificates? One thing that comes in here is that you need a network share. When you're importing and writing to Exchange, it's really going to want to do it through the web interface, and you have to give permissions to the service that actually processes your requests, okay? So we create a share. You can't just like save to a certain location. It's got to be saved to a UNC share. You want to give everyone full control. That's a little bit overkill. But really what that's saying is that everyone at the share level has full control. And then at the NTFS level, that's where we're actually going to restrict things, okay? So at the NTFS level, you want to give Exchange Trusted Subsystem, which is the service account, modify on NTFS so that it can read and write to that network share, okay? If you don't give that, it could be that when you try and write or read from the share, the service won't be able to. It's going to be like, I can't work like this, you know? And then you have to just massage those values, okay? You got to have a certification authority set up, which is pretty basic, just a role install. You create a certificate request, which we do through the interface in Exchange EAC, okay? So we're just like, yeah, give me a rec. I'm going to download it. I'll send it over to the share. We'll have the share, we'll have Exchange Trusted Subsystem process that request. Actually, no, it's the one that creates a rec. But then we pass it on to certification authority. We say, please, sir, can I have a certificate? We go over as administrators. We say, yes, you may have a certificate. Then we go and download and go, thank you, sir. We give it to the server, and then we install it there. And ideally, all of that works really well, okay? Now, if it doesn't work really well, you may install it, and it'll say invalid, okay? If it does that, try rebooting the server. Sometimes it doesn't pick up the cert right away. If you do a reboot and it's still giving you an invalid response, that means that you probably did one of the steps wrong. But if it just gives you an invalid initially upon installing it and you don't reboot yet, don't freak out. That just give it a reboot, see if it clears up, because like more than 80% of the time it'll clear up. Okay. If after that reboot it doesn't fix itself though, then you need to go back and see. There are certain steps that can go wrong. One of the things that people sometimes do by mistake is when they're sending the rec up to the server, instead of copying the contents of the request, they just try and upload the file itself. It doesn't work that way. You got to copy paste it, okay? So that might cause an invalid certificate result. If you get it working, then you just have to, once you import it into Exchange, you just have to link it to the services you want. Our primary concern is IIS, okay? You could associate it with POP and IMAP, but I actually don't want to have any kind of encryption for POP and IMAP because I want us to explore the protocols for now, okay? And with encryption in the way, we can't talk directly to the services, so it's a little harder to do that. So we are going to set up the certificate, we're going to put it on IIS, but we're not going to apply it to IMAP, POP, or SMTP. So now the idea here is when a client makes a connection, they're going to connect to IIS. They'll be able to authenticate the server and they'll stop complaining about it. Okay. So that's essentially the end of assignment 1. Okay. Auto Discover, you don't actually have to do a lot with the setup that we have. It just works out of the box pretty much. If you were setting up Auto Discover to work in the outside world, you would need to play around with DNS, have a virtual directory called Auto Discover that has an XML file that answers all these questions that we're trying to provide, right? But because we're working internally, Active Directory actually answers all the questions for us. There's nothing we have to do that we haven't already done, okay? Basically, the idea here is Outlook is just ready to get going. It can query Active Directory. It gets the information it needs. The user doesn't have to be asked a bunch of questions, okay? So it's a very useful feature. If it's not working for you, it could be because, it could be because certificates aren't configured properly, but that's not usually the case. It's usually something corrupt in your structure, okay? I've actually seen Active Directory objects, this is rare, but where there was like a space at the end of a string that was in an Active Directory object, and as soon as you took that space out, everything worked, but before that, it wouldn't allow Auto-Discover to function, you know? That's not too common, but you can get really weird problems that show up. Otherwise, you just Auto-Discover should be out of your way, and you don't have to think about it too much. Now, if you do have to massage Auto-Discover, you're typically using EMS. You're not really going into the EAC interface, and that's because for the most part it should work. If it's not working, you're getting into some more advanced crap, okay? And that, EMS handles, well, EAC handles about 95% of what EMS can do. So it's part of that 5% that's a little out there. When it comes to Auto-Discover internally, there's something called an SCP object, okay? That's a service connection point. It's one of those objects that you created when you did prepare AD. And this service connection point object provides answers to the clients when they want to know, what do I do next, okay? So it's really just an Active Directory object that has a bit of XML in it, but Outlook knows to look for it, can browse for it in Active Directory and get its own answers. So this is advertised by the CAS service. Clients know to look for it, and typically you don't need to involve a user. So the internal clients will just query the Active Directory object. External clients, you take the same XML that is in that object, and you got to throw it up on a web server for people to be able to request, okay? So if you're using Online Exchange, you don't have an Active Directory object. So you're going to be configuring an autodiscover.xml file. Okay? That is a key difference between online versus on-premises. You don't have AD objects to play with in Online Exchange. So it's, I'm hoping we'll get a chance to work around with that a bit in the second half of the course, depending on whether we can actually get some access to the cloud. Okay, so this works out of the box, should do. Internally, for external connections, you got to have that Auto-Discover your domain, DNS record. Okay, Outlook Anywhere. Just a marketing term. I'm going to talk about MAPI over HTTP and RPC over HTTP later, but those are basically two protocols that allow you to connect in and talk to Exchange. Okay, so what's happening is that we're wrapping all of this in SSL for security, but underneath that, there are other protocols at play. And Microsoft over time has moved from a less efficient protocol to a more efficient protocol. So MAPI over HTTP is more efficient. RPC over HTTP is older school, but still supported. Okay? If you have an old school client, like say, I don't know, Outlook 2010, right? They may not support MAPI over HTTP. In that case, you want to use RPC over HTTP, or at least enable it so that it can be used, right? The default with Exchange Server 2019 is over HTTP. I'll talk about that in the next lecture. But basically, Microsoft just uses the term Outlook Anywhere to indicate either of those protocols without more as a selling point for people. They're just like, yeah, you can use this from home. You can connect into your Exchange environment using HTTP, but they just call it Outlook Anywhere. right? If you're going to do that, you have to have a valid certificate with SSL enabled. To do that, you can either do internal clients or external clients. There's basically a Boolean value where you can say get Outlook anywhere. So I want to get the settings for this server. I want to get the Outlook anywhere settings, and I want to overwrite the internal clients require SSL Boolean value. If the default value is false, I'm going to set it to true. Okay. You could also do external clients require SSL and set that to true. Now, this is just what the default settings are. Okay. So external clients require SSL false, internal clients require SSL false, and then you get to toggle that if you want to. Okay. So here I'm just doing get Outlook anywhere, and I'm just looking at everything. But these are the two Boolean values you'd want to set if you want to manipulate Outlook anywhere in the behavior, either inside or outside. Okay, OWA. I just call it OWA, Outlook Web App. This is the web client. You'll find that it's actually kind of handy. Sometimes Outlook blows up on you for whatever reason, okay? And then it's something to fall back to. So especially when you're doing the assignments in this class, one thing you do not want to do is constantly log in as different users within the same profile, okay? So if you're on your Windows 10 client machine, don't just keep using OWA to log in as different users, because it will save some of those credentials. You'll probably click on something by mistake at some point, and then it's going to start confusing users, okay? And so then you're going to be like, I have access to this, but I shouldn't, but that's because you have a cached credential for somebody else. And so what I recommend people do is whenever you're acting as a certain user, log in as them on the Windows system, do everything as them, then log out or switch user to another user when you need to do it as them, okay? Regardless of whether you could do it as, just through OWA or something like that. But it is a useful tool to have. Once in a while, we just, you're supposed to do something through Outlook Web Access, and then, not Outlook, through Outlook, and then something's going wrong there, like a corrupt profile, you can just switch over to OWA, and it'll tell you similar information. Now, in an organization, most organizations enable this. Some don't want it to exist. Most of the hacks that come through Exchange are coming through Outlook Web Access, okay? And so if you turn that off, it's more secure. Users will complain about it. Depends on the policy of your environment and why you're making that decision, okay? But if you want to turn on or off OWA for a particular user, you can set cast mailbox, specify the user, and then specify, toggle the Boolean OWA enabled, either false or true, okay? If you want to do a more broad approach, you have to set policies. Like if you want a more targeted set of configurations rather than just turning it on or off, it gets a little more complicated. But here, for each user, you could just say you have access to it or you don't, right? So for example, you might not want the administrator to have mail access through OWA. That might be something you're just not willing to do, okay? So certain features can be enabled or disabled without turning on the whole thing, okay? That can be globally for all users, or it could be on a per user basis, but you have to involve something called OWA mailbox policies. So it gets a little more complicated when you're enabling for per user purposes, okay? When you apply mailbox policies on a mailbox, it'll override the settings of the virtual directory itself, so it will take precedence. Okay? We're not really going to go into mailbox policies because that is a little, I don't really think it's used that much, to be honest. Usually we just create settings for everybody and keep it uniform. There are times when you need to override, but it's not usually OWA that you're overriding. It's something like mailbox quota or something like that, okay? Okay, when you're logging in through Outlook Web Access, all you're looking at is a web form. Okay, you guys all took HTML. Did they ever make you work with web forms at all? Or did it kind of stop before that? Okay. So you know that forms-based has no inherent security in it, right? Everything that's sent is sent clear text. The only reason that it's secure is if you have SSL enabled and if it's properly configured. And that's why we really do need SSL. There's no other type of security built into this. So everything that you type in here is just being sent through HTTP, and it's only because we wrap it with SSL that it's protected in any way. Okay. Now I'll point out that it's you have to put domain username, so it would be enron / whatever your username is. That can be turned off. You can say, if a person doesn't put the domain, just assume it's Enron, okay? But that's extra configuration. By default, it needs to know the domain, okay? So if you just type in administrator and then you give a password, it's going to fail. You've got to actually provide Enron /, okay? Once you do that, you should be able to get in. You can define a default logon name, that is to say a domain name. So users don't have to type that every time they do. This is just the way that you can do it. So you just set on the OWA virtual directory the default domain name to whatever that wants to be. So in our case, it would be Enron, right? You can do that. I don't bother to in this class. I just kind of type it once and then I tell it to remember the credentials because we're not really in an insecure environment. Okay. If you do this because you don't like typing this too much, you got to restart the IIS service. So the best way to do that is actually just to reboot the server in our environment. But in a live environment, you wouldn't want to do that, right? You just want to restart IIS. Okay, ActiveSync. This is a bit more niche. It is just a different way of accessing mailboxes. Microsoft has come up with this protocol for devices that aren't as robust as some of the stuff that they're, that they've built, essentially, because the developers don't know all the ins and outs of Outlook, okay, or Exchange. So, here they're saying, access over the air, like wireless. You could do Exchange wirelessly. It's not really about that. It's more about the types of devices. So smartphones that are using different operating systems, right? Tablets, could be laptops. The idea here is that they can talk to Exchange without having to know all the nuts and bolts. Do you guys, I know they've replaced it now, but if you remember in Windows 10, there was a mail client, which has now been replaced with Outlook, right? It's like a cheaper version of Outlook. But there was a mail client, Windows Mail, that was there in Windows 10 for a long time. That used ActiveSync. Okay, it didn't speak the normal Exchange protocols. Now, the problem with this particular implementation, well, it's not really implementation. The problem with this protocol is that app developers will choose what they want to implement out of it. Okay, and so your results, your mileage will vary. You'll get one client where certain things don't work. You get another client where other things don't work. It's just a matter of what the developers knew to support and put the effort in to do. Okay. So some devices may not work as expected. Other ones will work fine. Testing is needed. Okay. But ActiveSync is kind of a backup option, essentially, if you have a device that just can't work with Outlook in the normal way. And this is enabled by default. You shouldn't have to do anything extra. And you can control them and the settings on that through ActiveSync mailbox policies. We're not going to mess with that. But if you do mess with it, EAC is not going to be able to help you that much. Okay, EMS is the way to go. You've heard that a few times now. The hint that you should take there is that when you're in this class, don't ignore EMS. It actually has some important features. Okay, even if you're a person who likes the GUI, feel free to use the GUI quite a bit, but EMS, you really need to be somewhat conversant with it. Okay. Some of the things that you can do, you can permit connection over Bluetooth, which is a little weird, allow cameras, allow Wi-Fi access, allowing attachments over ActiveSync. These are all kind of policies that you can set. Okay. Now, you can also do remote wipe with ActiveSync devices, which is kind of interesting. So if you're controlling phones for your organization, ActiveSync, that's actually a nice little ability which you can have where you're just like, yeah, okay, all of these devices need to be wiped now for whatever reason. You can also quarantine them. if they're not properly configured, for example. Okay. Or they could be blocked. So you could say these devices, if I have this type of vendor ID, we're going to allow those to connect in, and if it's anything else, forget about it. It's not allowed to connect. Okay. Configuring SMTP. This is pretty simple, as it says, simple mail transfer protocol, but it's very necessary. So if you don't do this, you're just talking to the people in your organization. You can't get out to the real world. So this is also configured on the client access server. It's really just about making send connectors and receive connectors, okay? And those are just basically connection points that your clients can connect to either get SMTP mail or to send SMTP mail. That's all. But you can configure those as an administrator, so you're like, I've got a send connector. Anyone can send through this, but they can only send internally, right? So why might you do that? You might have a very dumb scanner, okay, where the scanner says, I'll scan this for you, give me your email address, and I'll send you the document. But it doesn't speak Exchange. It speaks SMTP, okay, which is, that's all I would expect it to do. Then you need a send connector that can say those devices that are sending mail are not allowed to go outside. Okay, they can send to people in the organization, but you can't put an email address that's outside of our organization. This is also a way to control spam. Okay, so you say if a mail is going out from our server, it has to be from our domain. If it's not from our domain, we're not going to allow it to send out. Okay, that's one way that we stop spam. Receive connectors can be, they're not quite as, they don't do as much blocking as that, but you need a receive connector to be able to get mail from, say, the outside world. Okay. I'll talk about this in another area when we get into specific protocols, but this is just an example of how SMTP works. We're really going to go into this in more detail later, so I think I'll give it a pass here. Okay, creating receive connectors. There is a default receive connector configured to accept messages from the internet, okay? We're not very restrictive about that. We're not talking about spam filters. That comes later. But this is just the ability to receive messages from the outside world, okay? So it'll accept messages from anybody, which is why you receive spam, okay? Sometimes internal devices need to be allowed to connect to the SMTP server, so that's where the scanners can come in. The default connector doesn't allow these to be sent outside. That's a good thing, okay? You don't necessarily want it to be sent outside, but if you do want it to be sent outside, you have to create a different connector because these aren't configured for that. Okay, next class, I'm going to go into more details about MAPI over HTTP, things like that, RPC over HTTP. I think that's enough for now, though. We'll just kind of call it here. If anybody has any issues with their assignment, this is a good time to kind of bring it up to me or ask, okay? Whether you want to do it publicly or just on the side here. Any questions from the Muppets in the peanut gallery here? No, they're all tuned out. Okay. That's good. I'm getting tuned out too, so I'll let you guys go. But if you do have any questions, I'll still be here. Okay. I have a question regarding exercises. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, or you could just send me a message too, right? Do I like peanuts? Like